Good morning, everyone. I think we should begin this session. We're on time. So good morning and welcome to this session. Thank you for joining us. I think it's good to say you, the audience, are as important for the success of this session as our speakers, and so thank you for your interest. I'd also like to thank Lisbon Addictions for putting us on the main stage. This really indicates the importance of the topic, and we've put together an outstanding panel, I'm very pleased, who brings the latest data and insights really to fully address this topic. My name is Teodora Groshkova, and I'm representing the European Union Drugs Agency. It is my privilege to chair this session today. My co-chair is Roumen Sedefov, responsible for the Risks to Public Safety and Security Unit here at the EUDA, which covers both the EU early warning system and also the area on drug markets, crime and supply reduction. Now, we have a significant session ahead of us, which will address one of Europe's really most significant and challenging issues, the international developments in the opioid market and really their potential implications for both public health but also security in the EU. And so we'll travel the globe a bit. We'll explore these issues at their sources in Afghanistan but also beyond, but from the perspective of how they affect the European Union, how they affect Europe. So just to recall, in April 2022, the Taliban outlawed opium cultivation in Afghanistan. Up until then, the country accounted for around 80% of global illicit opium production, supplying almost all of Europe's market. Now, the ban led to a dramatic reduction in opium cultivation in 2023, and we'll hear detail about that. Subsequently, the European heroin market has been in motion, essentially anticipating a decline in supply. Now, several countries in Europe seem to report some impacts, including reducing purity of heroin, but also increased supply of opioid mixtures containing new synthetic opioids. So this clearly has implications for the planning and delivery of services, but also for research and policy. And just to remind us, there are previous examples of heroin shortages in Europe in 2000 and also continuing into 2001, which at the time led to changes in patterns of drug use, with switches in a number of European countries to synthetic opioids, but also synthetic catenones, and that's quite important to highlight at this point and to remember and keep in mind when discussing the potential shortages that might occur on the EU opioid market. And these changes back at the time, they persisted even after the shortage was over, requiring adaptations in how services were delivered. So are we prepared to respond if a scenario like that were to unfold again? I think that's a crucial question which we'll try to reflect on today. And with that in mind, today we'll be looking closely at market issues. I'd like to highlight that. This may not seem immediately relevant to in an addictions conference, but considering the broader market issues is really key to understanding public health implications when it comes to drugs. And so on the panel, I have 5 distinguished participants. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to be a strict time manager as well, and I trust our speakers will adhere to the allotted time. We are going to leave room for questions at the end after the presentations and after we have also heard from our discussant who is with us, giving you all an opportunity at the end of the session to reflect, to build on what speakers have brought up during their interventions. Without further ado, let's begin with our first speaker, who will cover in depth the latest developments in the opium market in Afghanistan. It is my pleasure to introduce Angela May. Angela is on the scientific committee of this conference, has been for a number of years, and so she's well known to many here. She's the chief of the Research and Trend Analysis branch at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, where she oversees global, regional, and national research in the areas of drugs and crime. She's responsible for the global reference research publications, a number of them, such as the World Drug Report, of course, the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, the Global Study on Homicides, and of course, quite relevant to today's discussion, the annual Afghan Opium Survey. Apologies. Angela holds a PhD in statistics, and while working for the UN since 1995, she has supported countries to improve their statistics and analytical systems. Angela will discuss the situation in Afghanistan regarding opium cultivation and heroin production. At the EUDA, we have expertise on the topic, but essentially this is UN domain, it is Angela's domain. So with that, it is my pleasure, Angela, to give you the floor.
Oh, it's automatic. Thank you. Thank you. So, why do we really care, and why are we speaking about Afghanistan when we think about Europe or when we talk about drug issues in the world? Well, the reason is that, we estimate with a lot of uncertainty, but that about 30 million people around the world use opiates, so either opium or heroin. And 80% of those using opiates actually use opiates originated in Afghanistan. So clearly, what happens in Afghanistan affects the global opiate market. So that's why, we start by talking about Afghanistan in a panel, talking about the future opiates in Europe, because clearly what is happening affects, most of the people worldwide that use opiates. Now, what is the situation in Afghanistan? Here you see the latest data regarding last year, that ends with last year, and you see that, over the years, there has been, the line is the production and while the bars is the cultivation. But basically you see that in Afghanistan, there has been really a period of very large production of opium. But that last year, in 2023, that has really reduced drastically, 95% reduction. Now, what you don't see is the 2024, and next week, we will release the data for the 2024 harvest. And what you will see here is still a very low level of production. So some little increases since 2023, but not going back to the big production. So what happened? Why suddenly Afghanistan changed? Well, the de facto authorities, as we call it in the UN, so basically the Taliban, has imposed a ban, a drug ban, and by the way, not just an opium ban, but a drug ban in April 2022. And while they left this ban in a way, loosely for the 2022 harvest, because in April was the ban, and the harvest of opium in Afghanistan happens, depending on what regions, what provinces, but, between May, June, July. So for that 2022 harvest, the ban was really not enforced. And you see there, the 22 production and cultivation was still very high. But then they really gave a strong message to farmers that in 2023 they would have enforced the ban. And even early as November 2023, when farmers started to decide what to plant for the winter crops, we saw that really they basically walked away from opium, and I'll show you later what they cultivated. So it's interesting to see also how, and here is the region. You may not know a lot about Afghanistan, but this is a map of Afghanistan on the different regions. But I'm sure you have heard that the large opium cultivation in Afghanistan has always happened in provinces like Kandahar, Helmand, and these are the South province. You see here on the left the concentration of opium cultivation in 2023. And you see that, the kind of cultivation was, even if it was very small, still concentrated particularly in Kandahar. In Kandahar, there were some pockets of very large opium cultivation, just in some few areas. And, but you see that the traditional province where the great majority of opium was cultivated in Afghanistan, Helmand, there was really a drastic decline. And you see on the right, you see the map with the change. So you see that the darkest color, so the biggest change in terms of between 2022 and 2023 happened exactly in provinces like Helmand. Interesting to note, and you will see when you will release next week the data, that actually we see re-emerging the provinces like Badakhshan, that is the one that you see there on the top right, but also Nangarhar. These were the provinces that really were the traditional cultivation area of Afghanistan before the 2000, when all of what happened in Afghanistan changed. So the southern provinces, the Helmand, the Kandahar, where the Taliban actually have been particularly present, also in the past, started to really emerge as provinces around the 2000. But traditionally, provinces like Badakhshan that now is returning with this small level of cultivation, they are emerging as actually the main province. And this, again, may not tell you a lot in terms of, okay, what do we care? Because there are also dynamics inside Afghanistan on, how the Taliban operates or control areas, etc. And so the opium cultivation and where it may now continue to increase or decrease has also implications for what is happening inside the dynamics of in Afghanistan. So here is just to give you an idea of the drastic change. So on the left side, you see the size of opium fields between 2022 and 23. So what happened is that, in some regions, particularly in the southern region, that are where the water is controlled, there were large fields of opium. Much larger, for example, when we look at fields in Mexico, Myanmar, etc. In Afghanistan, traditionally, there were, much larger fields. And you see how the fields started to become small and very isolated. So clearly, not to be seen by the Taliban. And here on the right, you see a map of what were in Helmand. All of what you see green, they were all opium fields in 2022. So just to give you an idea, if you had walked through Helmand in 2022 or 2021, etc., during the winter, you would have seen poppy, in much of the agricultural land. You see now just a few purple fields that in 2022 were opium. So you see the drastic change. So what were the implications for the farmers in Afghanistan? So you see here on the left that there are two ways on how usually illicit cultivation of drugs may reduce. One is farmers decide not to cultivate and the other one is eradication. The change that we see in 2023 was not much relating to eradication. So farmers really decided up front not to cultivate opium. And majority, they went to cereals. You see, from all what was poppy before, and then in 2021, in 2022, in 2022, and in 2023, basically a lot went to cereals. But that meant that their income decreased drastically. And you see, those bars are the estimate of the national amount of income that farmers obtain from the opium harvest. And you see, okay, over the years, how that have changed. But you see in 2023 that basically farmers overall lost about $1 billion. And $1 billion in a country where all of a sudden also the social and economic condition after the international community left really decreased very rapidly. So really the impact on the farmers is very strong. And why is important? Because it's important also to understand for the future how the farmers will cope with this. What happened, and then here is the price of the different drugs. You see the price of heroin, orange, the price of opium, the purple, and then the methamphetamine, the green. And you see that all of a sudden, when the ban was announced, the price went to the roof. Just as an expectation of a shortage, that actually did not happen right away, because in 2022, the harvest was still abundant. But on expectation, as soon as, by the way, as soon as the Taliban took over, the price of opium went up. And then it continued to go up when the ban was announced. And then you see here that, if in around 2020, you would have bought opium, a kilo of opium for less than $100, now is almost $800. So it's really, the price has really gone really to the roof. And that is an indication also, okay, when the ban was announced in 2022, the price went up. So this was very beneficial for those that had opium or that cultivated opium in 2022, because all of a sudden, they can gain more. And in 2023, the same. And in 2024, again, those that the little opium compared to previous years that was cultivated and sold in Afghanistan, then was very profitable. So today, having opium or selling opium in Afghanistan is extremely profitable. So the big question mark is whether the ban will hold. And if really farmers, out of desperation, really will go back to opium. We have seen this year, in 2024, a stronger reaction of farmers against, for example, eradication. The Taliban had reported to us that they did eradication. We could not verify, but there has been some anecdotal and field information that there was some eradication. But we have been seeing really a much stronger pushback from the farmers on limiting their choices. So, and the price here is the price in Iran. And you see as an indication of how this, on how what is happening in Afghanistan now is starting to reflect on all the routes that brings heroin to Europe. And here you see Iran, how the price is starting to going up. And the big question is that the shortage has not been felt in 2023. The question is, has stock and kind of filled a little bit of a shortage, but I guess Bryce will elaborate more on this. But here, clearly, again, the indication that the shortage of heroin is coming. But one other thing that I also wanted to highlight, not to forget, is that I understand that we are talking about Afghanistan to think about Europe, but I would like to make a plea that we also don't forget the people who use drugs in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan has among the highest level of opiates and drug use in the world. And here is, we are starting to do research, and then we will release research in the next few months on really also understanding the drug situation in Afghanistan, how has it changed, but also the service provision, the treatment. And here is an analysis that we have done on treatment, just to say how, that the primary substance for which people enter in treatment in Afghanistan is still heroin and opiates. But you see that synthetic drugs are also emerging. Here is just to say that the opium tells one story. But we need also to pay attention to what is happening on methamphetamine. Because again, eventually, methamphetamine has not arrived yet in Europe, but is moving very fast. From Afghanistan, we see it now really reaching very fast, even markets like in the Gulf countries that have been dominated by Captagon, now really entering into the methamphetamine. And what we see here is an analysis of seizures that we do. We continue to monitor seizure around Afghanistan because we can monitor opium cultivation looking at the satellite images, but we cannot use the satellite images to understand methamphetamine production. And so the way how we are trying to understand is to look at what is happening around in terms of seizure, with all the limitations of seizures. But here you see that while the heroin seizure started to go down very quickly, the methamphetamine actually seizure around Afghanistan are still increasing. And so as an indication that, maybe opium and methamphetamine are, in different trajectory in Afghanistan. So what are the implications? Well, one is that it's important also for Europe to close monitoring the rural developments in Afghanistan. Because if really for this drop to become sustainable, farmers really need support. They need to modernize the way how they do agriculture so that the crop that they cultivate instead of Afghanistan can be more profitable. But also, to think about the impact of climate change, and that is changing the way how farmers are making decisions. And it's so important to understand this in the context also of opium. But also to watch for illegal markets displacement. So not much of the farmers do not have a lot of alternatives, and the farmers will not move to methamphetamine production. Who is gaining from the methamphetamine production is very different from the farmers. But the traders, the group that was trading heroin, so will the replacement on other illegal markets? Could be the methamphetamine one, but also illegal mining, for example. And again, as I said, not to forget the people who use drugs in Afghanistan that desperately need treatment. And the analysis that we have done on treatment is that is really very insufficient to the demand, particularly for women. Very few treatment centers in Afghanistan actually treat and host women. But also the close monitoring of methamphetamine manufacturers so that, we don't replace the problem of opium with methamphetamine. And to finish, I only wanted to acknowledge, the great team that we have in UNODC to look at Afghanistan. As I said, those of you who may be interested in Afghanistan, we are going to release almost every month now a brief on the different issues relating to drugs in Afghanistan. And so we have a great team. Bryce is here, but a great team in Kabul, in Tashkent, where we have a information center in Vienna. We have a drug monitoring platform team where we monitor the individual seizures. And of course, the World Drug Report team. If you're again interested in this year World Drug Report, there is a dedicated chapter to look at the implication of the Afghan ban into global opiates market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. I took a few notes. really very important. The ban seems to be sustained for now. Steep reduction in cultivation continuing that trend from 2023. We're looking forward to the release of the data in a week or so. Continuing opium market, though, as evidenced by the seizures in the region. So I think that's important for us to note that as well. And even higher prices. So this really complicates what the ban means now, but also going forward, as you noted, for Afghanistan, but also for Europe and the rest of the world. So I do think this gave us really a vital context for understanding the evolving situation in Afghanistan and what the potential implications could be for Europe. And this is a convenient segue into the next topic. As was noted, one potential consequence of the reduction of cultivation and production in Afghanistan could be that other regions in the world assume a more prominent role in that domain in the global opioid market. And so I'm delighted to invite our next speaker, Bryce Pardo, to discuss this. Bryce is an international researcher in the area of drugs and crime policy. His area of specialization includes opioid control and regulations relating to new psychoactive substances, but this is just among many other areas indeed. He has worked with national, state, and local governments. Bryce is currently working, as Angelo mentioned, as a research officer at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Prior to that, he served nearly 5 years as a researcher at the RAND Corporation, 1 year of which he spent as the Associate Director of RAND's Drug Policy Research Center. Before completing his PhD in public policy at the University of Maryland, he served 5 years as an official at the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission within the Organization of American States. It is my pleasure to welcome you, Bryce. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Teodora. Thank you, everybody. I am pleased to be here. It's a bit of a bait and switch, or maybe a buy one, get one. I was asked to present on illegal opiate production in Southeast Asia, and as I was putting together this data set, or this slide deck, looking at the data, I realized it might be better to look at this as just beyond Afghanistan. We know that there are other producers out there, so thinking through kind of the threat vectors, not just from Southeast Asia, but elsewhere. Here we've got a couple pictures to kind of show that. The one on the left is poppy cultivation in Mexico, and the one on the right is a picture from Myanmar. So clearly the motivation why we all care about this, Europe has had a long-standing demand for Afghan-sourced heroin, and the latest EUDA numbers that I could find suggest that about 1 million individuals have used opiates in the past year in Western and Central European countries. So clearly the question is, well, what happens when the bottom falls out? And I'm not going to get into too much detail about Afghanistan here, but there are a couple pieces of information, some takeaways here on this slide. One is that we've seen drop-offs before. In 2001 was the first time we saw a substantial reduction in poppy cultivation and opium production in Afghanistan. That lasted just 1 year, just one season. And again, in 2023, we see this. Now, 2024 is unprecedented. We are kind of entering into new territory, uncharted waters here, as the ban seems to be holding. There will be an increase, but it's not going to be back to pre-ban levels. The other bit of information here is that there are other producers. So in any given year, Myanmar and Mexico kind of jostle for either the second or third largest producer. Again, smaller share of the global market, and these are important players in kind of regional areas. So in Asia or in the Americas. The last bit of data here is that if you look at the last part of that series from about 2018 onwards, there's relatively stable production in Afghanistan, suggesting that there was probably overproduction and a saturation of the market. So keep that in the back of your mind just for later, but it's good to note that. So as I had mentioned preliminarily, we are working on currently the Afghan opium survey numbers. Those will be released shortly. The story there is basically that there will be an increase, but it's not going to be large, and it's not going to be, by any stretch of the imagination, return us to pre-ban levels. That's what we saw in 2002, but that won't be the case in 2024. Myanmar has been trending up in recent years. And for 2024, we likely see kind of a slowing down of that increase, if not maybe possible reduction. So maybe more of a stability there in the total amount that's produced. Mexico in the last few years has been trending down and is likely to continue to see a decrease. So in Myanmar here, just to show you the poppy cultivation numbers, opium production numbers, and the yield, both are up. And the yield is actually at historic peaks here. So for 2023, about 23 kilograms per hectare were estimated to be produced. So this is very, very high. It does vary by states within Myanmar, but this was quite a shock to us. Traditionally, cultivation in Southeast Asia is a little bit more rudimentary, a little more subsistence. It's not as robust as what we've seen in some other places. Not very large crops, plots. Doesn't use a lot of kind of additional technology to produce opium. It seemed to shift a little bit in the last few years, where we did see this jump in yield, and that seems to be related to increased inputs. So by that, we do see stories of greater use of fertilizers, herbicides, as well as tighter plots. So you see a lot more plants in a given area, as well as the use of more advanced irrigation systems in some parts of the country. There was kind of a trending down in cultivation and production up until the military takeover in 2021. After that, we did see this reversal, and the story there seems to be that actors involved with illicit cultivation, in many cases, they have either ties to the government or government-aligned forces, and they could no longer access legitimate financial services or sectors, and so they used the illicit market to kind of continue funding their operations. So the key here is that Myanmar has rapidly jumped in the last few years. Again, 2024 will probably see it kind of leveling off, but the inputs that are being used in Myanmar seem to suggest more advanced cultivation practices. In Mexico, poppy cultivation peaked around 2017. I'm using US government data here because they're producing this on a calendar year basis. Ours are on harvest year, and they don't quite line up. And here we can kind of see a longer trend series that the US government has produced. So by and large, though, the story is that there was this peak, and this kind of correlates with what we saw in North American markets, where you'd see a lot of individuals in drug markets transitioning to heroin or accessing heroin in, say, the mid-2010s, and then you did see this move to fentanyl, and then as you see here, there's just kind of this downward trend. UNODC numbers for the last few years, we have been doing some reports there. We will be releasing one from Mexico covering the 21-22 harvest, and those numbers are again down. So this suggests that producers in Mexico are kind of responding to the market shift in North America, and they're just not producing as much heroin. So thinking about what this means for Europe, I mean, given that you have a large demand for heroin, or substantial demand for heroin, there are kind of three possible scenarios, and these are not exclusive. It's likely that some combination of all three could happen. The first is that stocks could cushion the shocks, in that there's enough opium in the system to kind of meet demand for a few years. The second is that alternative suppliers kind of come online. They pick up the slack that Afghanistan left. And the third is that suppliers in destination markets just transition. They move to a substitute drug, and that's where it goes from here on out. We did see some cases of that, say, in the Baltics in 2001. So again, these are the kind of three general scenarios that I'm going to walk through here, focusing mostly on the second one. But for the first one, stocks here, we did see, there is a historic precedent for this. In 2001, when opium went offline in Afghanistan, there wasn't enough opium in the system, either in Afghanistan or along trafficking routes towards destination markets, to meet demand at existing levels. We didn't really see, those that had studied the previous ban, didn't really see any severe price fluctuations in the immediate aftermath of that ban. Things kind of resumed to normal in a year or two later. So it's possible that there's enough there, given that historic precedent, to supply markets at existing levels. We are currently working on estimating opium within Afghanistan, the kind of existing stockpiles that may have been available to traders at the end of 2022 harvest, right before the ban was put into place. And it's likely that the amounts that we're seeing there it equates to several years of kind of pre-ban harvests. So it's possible that there's enough there kind of in the system. It's unclear how much is stockpiled outside of Afghanistan along the routes, say in the Balkan countries or Iran or in Western Europe. It's very hard to estimate that, but it's likely that players along the routes are holding inventory for various reasons. And then the other question is will Afghanistan return to poppy at some point? For 2024, that's not the case, but we'll see as time goes. I mean, there are pressures on the Taliban from the farmers, and given the price spikes, there's definitely an interest in going back to poppy cultivation. So the second scenario is that alternative producers step up supply. Currently, as I had mentioned, Myanmar is right now the global dominant producer, and this is just given the fact that Afghanistan went offline. But there are other potential players out there. Mexico, as I had mentioned, maybe Pakistan, Colombia has had a history of illicit cultivation, could be others as well. So they're kind of thinking about that. There could be other countries that could step up. But market segmentation and kind of imperfect information in these markets really impede rapid supply shifts. So by that I mean, you clearly can see here that there are three kind of major heroin markets in the world. The one in the Americas is largely supplied by Mexico and Colombia. Afghanistan is the dominant one for most of Europe and Africa and South Asia. And then you've got Myanmar and to some extent Laos supplying Oceania and Eastern Asia. But the market segmentation here and kind of imperfect information, again, really limits the ability with which dealers or traffickers can kind of meet demand in any given day. It's not easy for Myanmar trafficker to just start sending product to Europe tomorrow. Likewise, a dealer in the Netherlands can't just pick up the phone and call a producer in Mexico to meet up that supply shortage. So again, these markets, because they operate clandestinely, because they operate with tremendous law enforcement scrutiny, it's very hard for them to move quickly. So it may take time for an alternative supplier to kind of come online. That said, when I was looking at this and thinking about this, Myanmar is a dominant player, but I think Mexico has an edge here, especially for Europe. We have seen instances where Mexican drug trafficking organizations have been involved with drug markets in Europe. There has been some exchange of knowledge. Some Mexican nationals have been arrested in Europe, involved in the manufacture of methamphetamine. Mexico does control a large amount of the cocaine trade, so it's possible that they already have some know-how and some kind of connections to Europe to be able to develop broader and more ingrained distribution networks within the continent. Clearly right now there's an oversupply of heroin in Mexico vis-a-vis the US demand. I mean, the United States is not really much of a heroin market anymore because fentanyl has displaced that. It's not to say it's going to be gone entirely, but it's unlikely that we're going to be going back to pre-fentanyl era. So that means there's a lot more there in Mexico, or a lot more supply there in Mexico that could meet demand there. And then the ongoing conflict in Myanmar might be affecting the illegal markets. We did see some effect of that where you did see parts of the Shan state where there were increased activities that may have resulted in limited access to labor supply. The substitute. So here, this is the one that is potentially the most scary scenario, and that is that you do have enterprising dealers that basically say, the hell with it, we're going to go ahead and find an alternative opiate or opioid to distribute into local markets. This was the case to some extent in North America where you had dealers moving to fentanyl or other synthetic opioids. We've seen some instances of localized outbreaks. Some of the other panelists will be speaking about that. The experience in 2001 with the Baltics getting out of, Estonia basically moving to fentanyl, never returning to heroin. And there was a recent seizure, about 250,000 fake tablets containing fentanyl in Spain. It was coming from Colombia. It's unclear what was happening there, but this was declared as one of kind of the first early trials of trying to get fake tablets into Europe via Spain. Again, with substitutes, supply is scalable. I mean, synthetic drugs are easy to kind of scale up a lab. You don't have to wait for the poppy to come to maturity and harvest it. You can move your operations very quickly. And then the question here is, well, Mexico already, there's a lot of DTOs in Mexico that do supply fentanyl to North American markets. Why couldn't they do the same for Europe and supply fentanyl here? So, there's a big fat if depends. It depends. It depends on the size of existing stocks and the perception of availability. It might be that for a few years, dealers are comfortable and they realize that, okay, there's enough supply of heroin given the inventories that we're not going to move. It depends on the availability or the ability and time with which alternative opiate sources kind of come online. Again, plants take time to grow, trafficking and distribution networks take time to develop. A lot of times you have to kind of meet face to face and really gain the trust of these other interlocutors to be able to move product illegally. And then it also depends on the user reception and tolerance to substitute drugs. In some cases, maybe synthetic opioids are just too potent, too strong, too dysphoric. Users say, the heck with it, I'm going to go back, I'm going to get out of this and move on. I'm going to go seek methadone treatment or whatnot. So it really just depends on how the market can adopt to this. So what does this mean for the future? What does this mean right now? I mean, critically, this means that we need to continue to monitor these drug markets all along the route. So from production countries to try to understand whether or not we do see production emerging in countries that we didn't see before. So perhaps just outside of Afghanistan, perhaps in Mexico. We do need to start monitoring price along the entire supply route to give a better understanding as to whether we see kind of disruptions in supply. I mean, clearly prices going up suggests a limited supply. We do need to do better on monitoring purity of product because clearly purity going down suggests there is some sort of supply disruption. Doing more forensic and signature analysis of seizures as well to be able to attribute where this is coming from. So whether or not this seizure of heroin was made in Afghanistan or likely to be made in Afghanistan or Mexico based on the byproducts in there or the other kind of reactants in that seizure. And then clearly identification of new drugs in toxicology samples and in drug seizure samples is going to be needed to determine whether or not dealers in destination markets are moving to some sort of other novel compound that is not known today. So with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Bryce. Clearly, there is scope and need for monitoring beyond Afghanistan, and I think you quite rightly mentioned a number of potential alternative opiate supply sources, Myanmar, Mexico. However, it was good also to hear your eloquent discussion about the market segmentation phenomenon. I think, yes, we have an established picture of how supply is partitioned within the world, and so I have questions around that and look forward to the discussion later on. Really fascinating. With that, I give over the floor to my co-chair, Roumen.
Thank you, Teodora. I think we've trotted the globe and we'll be zooming in into Europe now. Just a brief reflection. There is still Afghan heroin in Europe. There are some signs about shortages, purity going down, but there are also signs at places where we have high purity heroin on the market, including clusters and outbreaks of overdoses. So really, there's quite a lot happening. So it's very confusing in a way, but also very important to understand. We'll now move to the possible implications of the heroin shortages in Europe and the emergence of synthetic opioids. Let's just note here that synthetic opioids have emerged quite some time ago in Europe. So yes, we have new groups, but they have been on the market. They have come and gone. There have been some spikes, some outbreaks, and this continues to be the case. So I would like to invite now our next speaker, Joanna de Morais. Joanna is currently being nominated as a Drug Alert System Program Manager. She has been working with our team from the European Union Drugs Agency since 2017 as a scientific analyst in the early warning system on new synthetic drugs. She has been responsible for signal management, open source information monitoring, and risk communication. Joanna has a master's degree from the Medical University of Warsaw in pharmacy, and she's a qualified person for pharmacovigilance, been working with the industries before. So, Joanna, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Roumen, and good morning, everyone. In my presentation, I will bring the European perspective to the table, and over the next 12 minutes, I will cover the points that you can see in the slides. So I will start with a brief overview of the heroin market in Europe and the lessons learned from the previous heroin shortages. Then we will have a look at the reasons why we are particularly concerned about the current situation and whether synthetic opioids do pose a credible threat to Europe. And in the end, we'll try to reflect a little bit on the current state of preparedness. So most of you know that heroin use has been central to the drug problem in Europe for more than 40 years. Heroin remains the most commonly used illicit opioid in Europe, and it also remains the drug responsible for a large share of the health burden associated with illicit drug consumption. However, heroin no longer plays such a central role as it once did. The opioid market in Europe is increasingly complex as a range of other opioids are more increasingly available on the illicit drug markets and are also more visible associated with dependence, mortality, and morbidity. And these include methadone, buprenorphine, to lesser extent opioid analgesics, as well as fentanyl derivatives, and more recently nitazenes. Heroin production in Europe is a marginal phenomenon. However, more recently, some countries reported a recent increase in the number of dismantled heroin-related production sites. And there is no sustained production of synthetic opioids, but I will come back to it later today. As already mentioned in the previous presentations, European heroin market is almost exclusively supplied with heroin from Afghanistan via Turkish, Iranian, and Pakistani criminal networks. So, of course, considering Taliban ban in 2022, we are all asking ourselves, what does it mean for Europe? If indeed heroin shortage happens, it would not be the first time that we are in this kind of situation. We fortunately have experience from the past, from the shortages in 2001 and 2010. So let's have a look, what have we learned from the past? From the monitoring perspective, it is important to look at how we can actually spot an unfolding shortage. So during the previous shortages, early signals included decreasing purity of heroin, increasing adulteration, increasing polydrug use. It is interesting that the situation was not the same throughout Europe. So a small group of countries appear to have experienced a severe shortage of heroin. And in some of them, heroin market practically collapsed and has never fully recovered. At that same time, in other countries, there were no signals of heroin shortage. Probably the most important lesson learned from the past is that even a short-lived heroin shortage can have a diverse and long-term impact on drug consumption patterns. So we all know that nature abhors vacuum, so some other substances emerge as a replacement. For example, fentanyl in Estonia, buprenorphine in Finland, or synthetic caffeinates in Hungary. And while the heroin availability quickly bounced back, these new patterns established during the shortage remained for many years. Overall, we need to expect the unexpected, as it is difficult to predict how drug markets will respond to disruption. So it's uncertain how the Afghan ban will affect Europe, and Bryce already presented some possible scenarios what can happen, and I would like to add a little bit to this. So if actual heroin shortage happens in Europe, we can see increased competition and territorial conflicts between criminal networks, which might result in a sudden escalation in violence. In addition, increasing prices of heroin and difficulties in accessing heroin might lead to increased vulnerability of people who use heroin and increase in risky behaviors, such as crime, injection, and aggression. As Bryce already presented, we might see diversification of criminal markets and heroin sources for the EU, as well as market shift to other drugs, which in fact might not be necessarily related to changes in heroin availability. And this shift might be to non-opioid drugs, such as synthetic stimulants or perhaps benzodiazepines, but also to synthetic opioids. And this last option is the most frightening one, and why we are so concerned about the last scenario. Well, first of all, the situation right now is very different compared to previous shortages. Synthetic opioids are more available and accessible due to globalized markets and online sources of supply. In addition, synthetic opioids are quite an attractive commodity for criminal networks. And why? Because they are more potent, quicker and cheaper to make. They can be produced closer to consumer market. They are easier to smuggle. So overall, taking these things together, they are just more profitable. Furthermore, we are all aware about the situation in the United States, and the opioid epidemic there is a good example how quickly changes in opioid use can happen, and how dramatic implications for public health these changes might be. Opioid epidemic in US is driven by illicitly manufactured fentanyl produced by Mexican criminal groups. And we know that these groups are increasingly involved in the European market for the time being with regards to production and trafficking of methamphetamine and importation and extraction of cocaine. But what if they decide to expand their portfolio and try to introduce fentanyl to European market? Last but not least, there are some concerning signals identified through the EU early warning system that I will come back in a minute. So the question is, do synthetic opioids pose a credible threat to Europe? Well, for the time being, they play a relatively small role in Europe, with the exception of Baltic states. Fentanyl on the European market usually comes from diversion of medicine or illicit production outside EU. There is no sustained production of synthetic opioids right now, but potential for such production exists because European drug producers already have access to precursors, they have existing infrastructure, equipment, and knowledge needed to make them. Currently, fentanyl is associated with a very small share of drug overdose deaths in the European Union. In 2022, 163 deaths related to fentanyl have been reported by the EU member states. Those were mostly related to fentanyl diverted from medical use, and while this is likely to be underestimated, this is not at all comparable with the numbers that we see in the United States. We, of course, have some protective factors in Europe, including strict prescribing practices, social healthcare provision, harm reduction, and for many years that it was availability of heroin, but what if we don't have heroin? Coming back to signals from the EU early warning system, since 2009, 87 new synthetic opioids have been identified on the European drug market. And in the beginning, much of the growth in this market was driven by fentanyls. Situation changed after the Chinese generic ban on fentanyls in 2019. There has been a switch away from fentanyls to equally potent nitazenes. And as of today, we are monitoring 22 nitazene opioids. 12 of these appeared over the last 2 years. In addition, we have seen an increase in seizures and deaths linked to nitazene opioids. Last year, there were 180 deaths with confirmed exposure to nitazenes reported to us. And while most problems with nitazenes right now are concentrated in Baltic states, we see an increase in the number of countries identifying nitazenes, as well as outbreaks of poisonings linked to nitazenes missold as heroin or fake medicines, and we will hear more about the Irish situation in the next presentation from Professor Eamon Keenan. Furthermore, emergence of dangerous mixtures, similar to what is happening in US and Canada. We are aware of cases of trunk dope and benzodope in Europe. And probably one of the most recent and most concerning developments is increase in fake medicines containing nitazenes in Europe. It seems to be quite an expanding market. So far, 12 countries reported identifications of such fake products. In the beginning, most of these were fake oxycodone tablets, but now we see more variety of tablets, including fake Subutex or even fake benzodiazepine containing nitazenes. And very significant increase in the quantities of such tablets is over the last 2 years. And why this is concerning, these tablets give false perception of safety and legitimacy. Of course, such tablets might appeal to broader populations, including young people. So we are wondering if this is another way to introduce new people to synthetic opioids. Taking this all together, we are wondering if these conditions create a potential for a perfect storm. Well, there are some signals emerging on substantial decreases in heroin seizures in Bulgaria and Turkey, which are key countries on the heroin trafficking routes. There are some recent signals of changes in heroin purity in some countries. And while some market adjustments might have occurred, we need to stay vigilant. So the question right now is, are we prepared for what is coming. Last month, the EUDA Executive Director issued a critical call for action to EU partners and member states, urging them to unite against the growing threat posed by new synthetic opioids. We need to be vigilant and prepared, and preparedness is a joint-up action. As EU countries face similar threats, we need to act together in order to succeed, and EUDA committed, strongly engaged with the RATOX network of national focal points, experts, as well as civil societies, in order to make sure that we remain resilient. And also considering our new activities granted by the new EUDA regulations, such as health and security, threat assessment, European drug alert system, monitoring of drug precursors, and network of toxicological and forensic laboratories, we hope to better support EU and member states in tackling this perhaps very significant threat to Europe. So I would like to thank, of course, all RATOX network, National Early Warning System correspondents, and also my colleagues from EUDA Risk to Public Safety and Security team for help to make this presentation. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Joanna. I just want to take a point on one of your slides that says the fall of fentanyls, and I think it's as some of my colleagues will say, this could be both overstated and understated. I don't think there is a fall of fentanyls, maybe new fentanyls, we see less of them, but this is something that can come very fast to bite us, because you have mentioned there is always a potential for production. Europe is a great producer of synthetic substances, which could be easily converted given the availability of precursors into production of fentanyls. We also know the presence of Mexican organized crime in Europe, which, as you will know, are very well specialized in fentanyl production. That's the first point I wanted to take from your presentation. Second point, which is very important, often neglected and somehow misunderstood, is, at least for Europe, when synthetic opioids are actually encountered in tablets. I've always had a fear of white powders in the past, and I think that my fear now has been exacerbated by various tablets, whatever the logo of the tablets is, and especially if the tablets are without the logo, they look like synthetic substances, which we have a lot in Europe, with unknown content. So this is a different group of users. This is a different group at risk, and I think we have to pay particular attention to the tablets. And the last thing is that you have mentioned the options and the possibility that other substances take place of the missing heroin, and we have this in Europe, synthetic catechinones. We have a lot of availability of synthetic catechinones, methamphetamine, cocaine, crack cocaine, benzodiazepine, so very complex picture indeed. I would like now to introduce our next speaker, Professor Eamon Keenan. Professor Keenan is quite well known for the right reasons, but lately he's been known as coordinating the Irish response to a number of overdose clusters or outbreaks associated with synthetic opioids. He has been working with the Irish National Health Authority as a national clinical lead of addiction services since 2016. He's a consultant psychiatrist in substance misuse and clinical professor in addiction studies in Trinity College. He has been working in the area for more than 30 years, published extensively, and among other things, he's also a member of the management board of the European Union Drugs Agency. So he will be dealing with a recent experience in Ireland with dangerous new synthetic opioids, nitazines. There have been at least 3 or 4 sessions about nitazines already, but you have a unique opportunity because of your experiences to give us the whole picture from the very beginning to the end. So you have the floor, Professor Keenan.
Thank you very much, Roumen, and thank you, Teodora, for inviting me to talk today. It's a real pleasure. So I'm going to talk about the situation that we've experienced in Ireland with nitazines, I suppose, over the course of the last year. Like many other European countries, we have various methods that we employ to identify emerging drug trends. They're at various different levels. So, for example, our drug checking services are a back-of-house service that we're providing at festivals, and then in some emergency situations we can do it. So it's not the full drug checking, but we have various different other methods, and two of them I just wanted to highlight were the syringe analysis and the wastewater analysis. Ireland has been a participating member of the ESCAPE project for the last 3 years. And as people know, that there's a month during the year when sample needles are collected and analysed. So in October 23, we did our syringe analysis, and we did not identify any synthetic opioids. And yet, 1 month later, we were in a situation where we had overdoses presenting. Similarly, our wastewater, we've now linked in with the European Score Network in relation to wastewater analysis, but that had not either identified the emergence of any synthetic opioids. So we do know, we've heard about the situation in relation to nitazines right across Europe and the different countries that have experienced it. But I suppose in 2 countries, in France and in Ireland, and apologies to French colleagues for suggesting that Ireland might be the same size or importance as France, but I don't often get the opportunity to do that, so you'll forgive me, I'm sure. So Ireland then and France both experienced overdose clusters with nitazines which were not contaminated with heroin. So there were no opioids in the samples that were analysed, only nitazines in comparison to other European countries. So I just want to talk to you about the situation that arose on a Thursday morning, on the 9th of November last year. Our office began to get phone calls in from the homeless service providers in relation to an unusual pattern of overdoses that were occurring. People were collapsing very quickly. They were telling services that they had been sold what they were called Chinese heroin or extra strong heroin, and very quickly they were identifying that this was something different. So we contacted the emergency departments. There's 2 main hospitals in Dublin city centre, and the ambulance services, and they confirmed that the situation was pretty chaotic. So, for example, in that first 24 hours on that Thursday, we had 34 overdoses brought by the ambulance services to the 2 emergency departments, which created a significant amount of chaos. A normal day, we would see 2 to 3 overdoses presenting to the emergency departments. But that day we saw 34, and we decided then to use the overdose presentations brought by ambulance to hospital as the metric for how the outbreak was developing. While some other overdoses might not have been brought to hospital, we just used the hospital overdoses. So very quickly we put out a risk communication. We used our key stakeholders in the NGO and peer sector to be able to target those individuals most at risk, and it was the population who were homeless and were injecting heroin on the street. That evening we got a sample. Law enforcement were able to get a sample and they transported it to the lab. Friday morning we continued to work with our partners. Anna Liffey were particularly supportive in this regard, and the risk communication continued to be circulated. The lab identified nitazines. So this was the first time nitazines had been identified in Ireland, and that allowed us then to raise the risk level to a red alert, because obviously we'd heard about nitazines, but we had never seen them before. One novel thing that we did was we worked with the Dublin City Council to post warning signs on our electronic traffic signals. It's all very well for me going out on the 9 o'clock news and talking about our risk, but people who are using heroin on the streets are not watching me on the 9 o'clock news, but they will see the warning signs on the street traffic signals. That was previously done in the Netherlands in associated with Red Alert, but it's also something that people got used to during COVID. We were all used to driving around and seeing traffic signs. We were able to identify a further substance, a further nitazine in one of our labs, and with that mobilization, by Sunday evening, we had no overdoses in Dublin City on Sunday evening. So 57 overdoses in that outbreak cluster, but people stopped using it because of the information we were providing. About 3 weeks later, then we had a similar situation in our second city, Cork. we had 20 overdoses. We had the experience from Dublin to be able to put in place the warnings very quickly. And a key part of the warnings was that we got the substance, we got a picture of the substance, and we were able to put that picture out and inform people who were using drugs that this is the sample of drugs which is causing overdoses. So we see there a picture of the heroin and a picture of the nitazines. It was interesting. Law enforcement did apprehend the individual who had sold the drugs in Cork, and he confirmed that the drug dealers in Dublin had told him, we're not selling any nitazines anymore in Dublin, bring it down to Cork and see how you will do down there. So the information we gave was effective, but it moved it to another city. Then in January, we had a significant police seizure of protonitazine when 2.83 kilograms were seized in 9 plastic packages. And the police, the local police on Garda Síochána, were very clear that this was for local distribution. 1 bag was pure, uncut protonitazine. So it was very clear that the drug dealers were identifying this as a new and emerging drug that they were going to start selling. We had overdoses then in the Irish prison system in March, just before St. Patrick's weekend. We had 5 overdoses. We got a sample then brought to us by law enforcement, and we again identified the same nitazine that had been involved in the 2 previous overdose clusters, N-protonitazine. And this was confirmed by NMR as being the same batch of drugs that had been circulating previously. So then, as Joanna and Roumen has mentioned, we had benzodiazepine tablets containing nitazines causing overdoses in June of this year. We were again informed about an unusual pattern of overdoses associated with fake benzodiazepines. So these were yellow tablets being sold as alprazolam. You saw the blister pack that they came out of in Joanna's presentation. But once again, this was happening in 4 different areas around the state. We were able to get a picture of the substance transported to our laboratory by the police. We identified it on our GCMS machine as containing protonitazine. So this was a different nitazine. Once again, we issued the red alert very quickly with the risk communication communicated to our stakeholders, and we had overdoses return to normal levels very quickly. Just to mention, we had another scenario where in August we had 11 overdoses in a prison in the Midlands of the country over an 8-hour period. There was significant panic that ensued. Naloxone was administered. It wasn't having any effect, so they just kept giving more naloxone. And they put out to the media that the nitazines were in the prisons again. But once we saw them in the local emergency department, it was identified these weren't opioid overdoses. We got a sample of the drug that was involved, and it was a novel benzodiazepine, clobamazolam. First time we'd seen that in Ireland. So for our services, the learning was that there's a real volatility in the drug market at the minute. Very careful clinical assessment is needed, and it shows the importance of obtaining the sample for toxicological analysis. But just to think about it, so you had 11 presentations to a small regional hospital ED department, each of whom were accompanied by 3 prison officers brought in. So it created difficulties. They had to do a hospital transfer, that another hospital had to be used for regular medical services. So it had a significant impact. So to talk a little bit about what we've been doing is we've established a national red alert group to look at all these unusual clusters and respond quickly. So it's chaired by our office, and it's really important that the health service, the HSE, also include our communications department. You saw the effective way we got the information out to the target group, and the communications were really important. So we have the National Ambulance Service, we have our toxicology laboratories, we have the National Poisons Information Centre, we have law enforcement with our National Drug and Organised Crime Bureau, we have the hospital emergency departments, and people may have seen Adrian Muti presenting yesterday. We have Trinity College, and we have the Health Products Regulatory Authority on the committee. We meet regularly when a situation arises that causes overdoses of concern. What we have done is we've developed guidelines to inform local areas about setting up similar types of groups that can respond effectively to a local situation, so that we're transferring it out to the regions. We developed a fact sheet for medical care providers, because when the nitazines first came, a lot of medics or a lot of the emergency departments had never heard of nitazines before. Everybody has heard of fentanyl. Everybody knows about the crisis in North America. Everybody's seen the Netflix documentaries. But when it was nitazines, it was, yeah, nitazines, you know, what are they, you know? At least it's not fentanyl. And so the fact sheet is really informing medical colleagues about what's needed to respond and manage these overdoses. We've emphasized within this the importance of obtaining samples for toxicological examination, both blood, urine, and sample of the product if possible. We've been very proactive in distributing naloxone. We've got a few initiatives which we've developed. We did a street art initiative where we had a QR code that people could link into for awareness around naloxone. We're giving people naloxone on release from prison and people who are at high risk from emergency departments. So far this year, we've given out, well, by now it's about 5,000 units of naloxone. We've had 280 incidents where we've used naloxone, so it's been effective, and we're working with Garda Síochána to try and get them to carry naloxone, because they are often first responders. And just, yeah. We've invested also this year in peer-to-peer training of naloxone. We've developed a circle program. So this is in collaboration with one of our peer organizations, ISCA, where we were looking at 16 circle programs right across the country. We're training peers in the recognition of overdose and carrying naloxone, and then they're given support after the training is finished over the 6-month period. Also good to note, just yesterday we heard that the Irish Prison Service have agreed to do peer-to-peer training in the Irish prison, do the circle program in the Irish prison, and Irish prisoners may now be carrying naloxone in the prison. So that's a real development that we're very pleased to announce. So our experience then is naloxone works. You don't need huge extra amounts of naloxone compared to heroin, and that was reported yesterday as well in one of the sessions. We did amend our naloxone information to include information about nitazines. You need to be aware about the emergence of benzodiazepines, and we've published recently on this. My colleague Nikki Colleen, who's really been a huge support in terms of coordinating our response. Just briefly, I'm going to talk on the detection. We've used FTIR machines at festivals, but they didn't identify the nitazines in any of the powders that we obtained. So they weren't sensitive enough to the nitazines. Our GCMS machine did identify the nitazines, but obviously that's not portable. And what we are thinking, and what we know now, is that analytical capacity is a real priority to have a really rapid public health response, because it does make a difference when you're able to go out and say what the substance is. People listen to that. And then our NMR confirmation allows services to track movement of substances. There's been a lot of talk about the strips. Our own experience of using the test strips for nitazines in the field is that they weren't very good for powder. We were getting a lot of false positives associated with heroin itself. There were no nitazines in it. It's also difficult to read, you know, and we were looking at it in a laboratory setting, but if you're using drugs on the boardwalk at night time in Dublin, it's going to be difficult to use. What we did find is with the pills, with the nitazine pills, that we were able to more clearly identify nitazines in fake benzodiazepines, and that's just a slide of that our colleagues in the National Drug Treatment Centre Laboratory developed in relation to the benefits of using it with that population who might be using tablets. So to finish up, our sense is that each country needs to develop the capacity to identify the nitazines, because that is a really key element of the public health response. You do need a national coordination group, we would say, with addiction services leading on that. Our key things that we use in that group are communications and the link with law enforcement, because they're the ones who are transporting the drug to us to analyse. You need to have really strong links with community, voluntary and peer organisations, because they're able to reach people who are using drugs very effectively. So it really requires investment in analytical capabilities and personnel and equipment. You need to have clear processes in relation to reporting. You need to have clear procedures and roles. And the communication with the at-risk groups needs to be very accurate, very prompt. And our final thing is that the dedicated early warning system with an appropriate risk communication is essential. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll be extremely short, so the presentation was very detailed. I just want to note two things. First is response was rapid, and very importantly, it's continuing, it's evolving. So it's not like you have done something and now you're very happy about it. And maybe I point here for clinicians treating, as we heard yesterday, nitazene and fentanyl toxicity doesn't make a lot of, it's not very different. So as long as you identify it's an opioid. Maybe for first responders, that's a different conversation. I don't want to have it here. Thank you once again. We hope we have a little bit of time for questions in the end. I'll hand over to Teodora.
Thank you, Roumen. It is a privilege to have a discussant to this session today, and Steve Taylor is with us to offer some discussion points on what we heard during this session. So Steve is a program manager with the drug and alcohol team in the UK government's Department on Health and Social Care, working on clinical and harm reduction programs, including the new national drugs early warning system. Steve started work in the drugs field in 1980s. After gaining a degree in pharmacy, he joined the National Treatment Agency for Substance Misuse in 2006, which then transferred in 2013 to Public Health England and subsequently to the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities in the Department of Health and Social Care. Of course, the UK has also recently experienced reduced purity in heroin and increased supply in opioid mixtures containing nitazenes in particular, among other synthetic opioids. So, and the related harms to the use of these supplies. And so these developments will have informed Steve's views and perspective on the session today. With that, I invite you, Steve, to offer your views, and please short if that's okay with you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to speak, and thank you to Angela, Bryce, Joanna, and Eamon for 4 fascinating and complementary presentations, and Teodora and Roumen also provided some very excellent summaries of the key points. It's kind of hard for me to know what to add. I think what is really clear is there's a challenge to all of us to try to predict the future based on what we've seen and heard here. I do want to reflect a little on what we've heard and talk about the implications for the UK and especially for England, but kind of always thinking about our place in Europe and the wider world. As Teodora touched on, what we're seeing now is already some sustained incidents of nitazenes in particular since June 23. They first popped up in a few pockets, geographical pockets, but we're now seeing cases pretty much all over the country involving 12 different nitazenes that Joanna mentioned, and now up to hundreds of deaths across the UK. And we're also starting to see them in multiple drugs and medicines also, as Joanna mentioned. Some of you might have seen that the latest statistics on drug deaths in England and Wales came out just this Wednesday, and deaths are sadly up again, as they have been almost every year for the past 10 years. Half of the 5,000 deaths are still accounted for by opiates, mostly heroin, only 50 in those published figures by nitazenes. But we know that there's quite a lag in the reporting of figures, so we're not going to see the deaths that we've been recording recently reported probably until next year. The other thing we have seen in the deaths is slightly outside the topic we're discussing here, but is a very significant and continuing rise in cocaine deaths, and that is something that we're going to need to keep a very close eye on, particularly given some of what we've heard about the possible switch from one drug type to another. Well, I think what we have heard is it kind of isn't yet clear whether reduced heroin purity is due to the global situation. What we can see, again going back to cocaine, is a very clear difference in trend there. We saw big drops in both heroin and cocaine purity at the start of the pandemic. We were expecting those due to the travel restrictions. But cocaine purity is completely recovered and is now higher than ever. Heroin purity began increasing, but then it's fallen again since the Taliban ban was announced. So global supply is at least a plausible explanation for that. Definitely, whatever the cause, heroin purity is down and probably incentivizing this increase we're seeing in nitazines among dealers and users. Most of the nitazines we're seeing at the moment are in heroin. It's been seen in 30% of the heroin samples taken from one area. We're also seeing them in benzodiazepines, opioid pills, cocaine, ketamine, synthetic cannabinoids, and we've just had reports of a nitazene in ecstasy tablets. And we heard a bit about what's happening in prisons. I think kind of prisons in the UK are lagging behind a bit. We are starting to see nitazines appearing, but not on the same scale yet as in the community. So the situation is with heroin changing is probably very different to previous shortages because of the synthetic opioids being much more available and accessible. There's an argument to say that previous heroin shortages have actually been a good thing for the UK in terms of deaths. So there are other factors influencing heroin deaths, but the amount available to be consumed is a significant one, and we have seen close correlations in short-term and long-term trends. As Bryce suggested, the opium and heroin stocks that still exist may be slowing and kind of softening the blow that would otherwise be coming to the UK from nitazines. So as Bryce has said, well, we could see any one of those circumstances that you were talking about, maybe one or more alternative heroin supply sources, maybe fentanyl. I think more likely is that we're just going to see more nitazines imported and maybe produced in-house. And that will probably happen whatever happens with heroin supply. That kind of the genie is out of the bottle. As we've already heard, nitazines, they're cheap and easy to manufacture, they're easy to transport, they're more cost effective. Why wouldn't crime gangs use them? What we're not seeing at the moment is our established kind of heroin users being replaced by any younger cohort of opioid users, but there is a fear that as more nitazines and other drugs are appearing in pills in particular, we might get more young people falling into using those. I thought the question I heard earlier about user reaction to alternative drugs is a really interesting one. As I say, young people may be more likely to accept pills and therefore susceptible. Just going back to the question of stimulants, and again, this is a kind of slightly off the opiates topic, but we've seen cocaine being more widely used by heroin users and causing more deaths. And we probably have an even greater fear if methamphetamine starts to come over to the UK, as Angela referred to, because we don't have any really well-established treatments. We don't have a treatment system experienced in treating it and might struggle there. I've got a very long list that I'm not going to go through. You'll be grateful to hear of the things that we're doing to prepare. They echo an awful lot of what Eamon was saying and what other speakers have said. I guess the point is that we have an early warning system that we're growing, we're developing rapidly, and what we need to do is use the information that comes into that, as we heard in another session, to really drive the policy response. It's a very long list. I suppose the long list would have been mostly public health responses, some of which, as I say, you've heard about. The other thing I just wanted to touch on is there's obviously also significant legislative and enforcement activity. So we have introduced controls on the new synthetic opioids. We've also seen local police enforcement on the specific incidents really making quite a difference. You see a massive rise in deaths suddenly, and then they go in and they crack down hard on the dealers, and the deaths fall off. Whether or not they can sustain that as it becomes much more widespread, it remains to be seen. So the last thing I just want to say, though, the UK obviously isn't in the European Union anymore, but we are looking forward to much closer working with the European Union Drugs Agency and its member countries, and to understanding how our early warning system can work better with your early warning system. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve, for drawing together those themes. We have about 5 minutes to take questions from the floor. I would invite you to take theirs. Microphone 1, microphone 2, I've been monitoring them. I see there is a question lined up on microphone 2. You have the floor.
Thank you. Bobby Smith, I'm a child psychiatrist working in Dublin Addiction Services. So my question is about the shift in perception among people who use opioids regarding drugs like fentanyl and nitazene. At the moment in Europe, it seems to be perceived as an unwanted and dangerous adulterant. And there's been cooperation amongst people who use opioids to avoid using these drugs when they're informed of their presence. Obviously, things have shifted in North America to it being seen as a drug of choice. And I just wonder, is there any insights in terms of what happened in North America about that transition? Are there certain subgroups who are more likely to move to pursuing these high potency products and transition away from heroin? And I suppose what I'm speculating is our older population of opioid users in Europe, it's largely a class of drugs that are shunned by people under the age of 30. Might that be what's protecting us to date? That our young people may be more, who are already addicted to opioids, more likely to make that step?
Thank you very much. There is a clinical dimension, so I take the liberty to direct this to Professor Keenan, and please keep your answer short. In the meantime, I see we have a question at mic 1 as well, so that we will take next, and I think that will lead up to the end of the session. Professor Keenan.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby, for the question. So obviously in North America there's been a very different dynamic in relation to fentanyl, and we had the whole issue in relation to pain prescribing that led to the opioid epidemic and being taken over then by the Mexican cartels. In relation to our young people, I think the drugs of choice that we're seeing with our young people are more along the stimulant drugs, as Steve has mentioned. I suppose what's happened with the synthetic opioids, and the worry that I saw was the tablets that emerged, because they could, while opioid users will take illicit benzodiazepines, other people will take illicit benzodiazepines, and they may well not have any tolerance to opioid drugs, and we could have a problem there. So I just think it's really important that we continue to be really vigilant in relation to the emerging trends and get out clear information around the harms associated with nitazines. We saw that with the population, with the older population in Dublin, that they did take on board the information that we gave them out around the risks and harms, and they very quickly moved away from taking the nitazines. So they weren't actively seeking out nitazines at this point. That may change. We've got ethical approval to do some research on the population who had been taking the nitazines at that time, so we'll be able to explore a little bit more about motivations and about the risks that they perceive in relation to substances. But it's a time when I don't know if we can definitively say what's going to happen. We do need to keep monitoring and looking at the emerging trends.
Thank you, Professor Keenan. There's one more question. Please bear with us. The lunch is not very exciting. You have seen it yesterday, so stay put if you can. Paul.
Hi. Is the mic on? Yeah. I mean, we're in really great panels. Thank you very much. But a question: we're an international European conference from an international perspective, and we've heard very much about discussions North America, European market, Afghanistan. But if we look at the figures, both in terms about the large opiate-consuming populations and possibly also transitions there with methamphetamine, they were actually Africa, they're Pakistan, they're Iran, there's Middle East. If we're going to, and they might be much more vulnerable to these changes than the sort of smaller and much more lucrative European market. So inviting Angela or Bryce to comment a little bit, what's happening else? What are the knock-on effects outside the areas that we're, outside the light where we're looking?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Do you expect an answer to that? I think it's
I expect a comment.
Right, it's more like a comment, but if Angela wants to say a word on that, she's very welcome.
Just, Paul, you really hit on the point, and indeed, these are much more vulnerable than the European. The Afghanistan as a start, but thinking about India, it will be interesting also to see, because the biggest population of opiates is in India, but there is also illicit cultivation in India. So, and that's us to see whether the offset of Afghanistan will be.
This was a session about Europe. However, is one more question from the audience, please? Microphone.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for a very interesting panel. And, it may work like this. I'm Andrea Capuchan from Sweden, and I have a pharmacological question with clinical implications. What do we know about receptor affinity to the mu-opioid receptor of nitazines? How is it compared to other opioids? And also, what do we know of synergistic effects of nitazines with CNS depressant drugs? Because most intoxications happen in concordance with benzos or pregabalin, etc.
I got it. There's Professor Christoph Stolf over there. He's studying extensively that, so may I suggest you talk to him? I'm sure I can say a few things, but definitely not as good as he can do that. So please talk to him. Dear colleagues, we are close we have to close this session. We have been singing the mantra of preparedness over and over again in most of the sessions here, but apparently we understand very different things when we speak about preparedness. I just want to make a very short detour here about preparedness. The first thing about preparedness is it takes place in advance of the threat emerging. So that's very important, you know. And then preparedness means capability, which is capacity and knowledge. We need to have both. We need to have the capacity, we need to have the knowledge, and it involves public health, care system, law enforcement, communities, and very importantly, individuals. So we all have a role to play in preparedness, and I think if this is the note that you take out of this session is, we all have individual responsibilities to anticipate, prepare, very importantly, prevent, rapidly detect, assess, respond, and very importantly, recover from any instances where we need to respond to drug-related and public health threats. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about preparedness. I find it's important that we understand our personal responsibilities with that. And with this, I give the floor to Teodora to do the closing of the session.
Thank you. We're just a little over. I would like to thank this excellent panel and, of course, the audience for being with us. You made this session worthwhile, so thank you very much. And with that, the session is closed.